All rise.
The Kosovo Specialist Chambers is now in session.
Please be seated. Go ahead.
Your Honor, before we start, may I apologise to all members of the panel and all other parties and participants in court for the delay this morning, for which I'm solely responsible.
Thank you. It's happened to all of us, I'm sure, so we'll survive. So, Madam Court Officer, please call the case.
Good morning, Your Honors. This is case CBC 2020-06, the Specialist Prosecutor versus Hashim Thaçi, Kadri Veseli, Recep Selimi, and Jakub Krasniqi.
I'm sorry. I note that the accused are all present in court today, with the exception of Mr. Krasniqi, who is appearing via video link. Before I invite the witness to the courtroom, I remind you that, as previously communicated today, we will not be sitting in the third session. Therefore, we will adjourn at 1 p.m. SPO, are you ready to advise us as to the witnesses you intend to call next week?
Yes, Your Honor. That was confirmed in an email sent yesterday at about 17:41, but those numbers would be W03827, W04255, and W03724.
Say three. Again.
3724.
Okay. We will be continuing the cross-examination. Mr. Emerson, just a request from us, from the panel. When you read from a document that you don't have the ability to put on the screen, please give us the paragraph or page number of what it is you're reading so that we are making an adequate record.
I'm sorry, did I fail to do that?
Yeah. Yes, I know it was inadvertent, but just remember to do that. And number two, as often as possible, get it on the screen because it's much easier for all of us to read along with you, and then we can scroll back if necessary. So, okay, Madam Usher, you may call the witness in. Good morning, witness.
Good morning, judges.
Today we will continue with your cross-examination by the defense. I remind you to please answer the questions clearly with short sentences. If you don't understand a question, feel free to ask counsel to repeat the question or tell them you don't understand and they will clarify. Also, please remember to try to indicate the basis of your knowledge and the facts and circumstances upon which you will be questioned. I remind you that you are still under obligation to tell the truth as stated by you in your solemn declaration. Also, please remember to speak into the microphone and to wait 5 seconds before answering a question, and speak at a slow pace for the interpreters to catch up. If you feel the need to take a break, please let us know and we will accommodate you. Now we'll continue with the cross-examination And by the Vasili defense, Mr. Emerson will be asking you the questions again at this time. Go ahead, Mr. Emerson.
Thank you.
Mr. Abrahams, whilst overnight, in the light of the answers that you gave yesterday about the way that you approached the reliability of sources when simply lifting information from previous reports of the Humanitarian Law Centre, we have obviously looked in more detail at the sources used by the Humanitarian Law Centre. And would it surprise you to know that in a number of instances where you have described an event having occurred, citing the Humanitarian Law Centre report as your source, the source that's cited by the Humanitarian Law Centre for that proposition is the Serbian media? Does that surprise you?
I would have to look at what you're referring to.
Well, I'll show you if we need to use the time in that way, but can you answer my question? Would it surprise you to know that when you are signing off allegations as attributable to the Humanitarian Law Centre, you are in fact citing two instances where the Humanitarian Law Centre has used Serbian media as the source for its allegation?
I can't answer that question unless I am presented with the example.
Is it loaded up? It should be. Yeah. Can I have the... I'll need the ERN, please.
It's just here.
Ah, I see.
And the passage is there.
Okay. So we've added this document to our queue and therefore request the court's permission to call it up. We have added it since the answers that the witness gave last night, precisely anticipating a response such as this.
No, Your Honor.
So, thank you. So the document...
I'm sorry, call it up and put it on the screen.
Yeah. The document in the queue, it should be SITF 00413 220. 220. That's what you've done.
Oh, yeah.
What's this number then? What's that supposed to be?
This is the page that it's at.
Well, why has it got a different number? Oh, I
You
see.
call it there.
Now, you recognise that as the Humanitarian Law Centre report, and we see the title at the top, Kosovo Disappearances in Times of Armed Conflict.
Yes.
And if we look at, I'll just do it once for you so that we can then, I'll give you some other references. But if we start with page 3230, so that's instead of 3224, sorry, instead of title page 3220, it's 3230. And if we look at the entry at paragraph 2.14, just below the halfway point, could we perhaps enlarge that? You'll see a reference to the abduction of Branko Stalatic of Mlechan, and then there's a description of the events that are said to have occurred, and you'll see there very clearly the source cited is the Belgrade media. Correct?
Correct.
Right. Could we now call up your report in which that issue is dealt with?
It's P380. P380.
Yes, it's now got P380. Thank you very much for that. and it will be at page marked 0364871. If we look at the entry on the top of the page, this is your report that followed a month later. You see that? There, the facts are related exactly the same.
It's the same.
Yes, Ratko and Branko Stalatic. And
Only references to them.
you cite that, well, you see it in the text, according to the Humanitarian Law Centre. And then if you look at 142, it's the footnote at the bottom of the page. It is a reference to the document we've just looked at. You see?
Yes.
So, I mean, I can take you through other examples, but I think that's sufficient to make the point. So, when you then deal with these issues in the following report, in other words, that is what we've just looked at. That is your report published in October 1998. The Humanitarian Law Centre's report had been published on the 5th of August. You're publishing your report in October, and then very shortly afterwards, in December, you publish Detentions and Abuse in Kosovo, in which the same information is repeated, but this time it's no longer cited to the Humanitarian Law Centre. This time you cite to your earlier report. So what we see having happened here is it goes from the Serbian media to the Humanitarian Law Centre, from the Humanitarian Law Centre to you, and from you then without citation backwards to yourself. You see?
Yes.
No, maybe the witness can be excused if no questions are going to be asked of
No,
him.
I'm sorry. The witness asked to have the point illustrated. I've illustrated it to him because he wouldn't answer the question in the first place.
Please ask the question now, because you've made a statement and there's no
Well,
question.
first of all, do you accept that chronology?
The chronology of the reporting?
The
Yes, I
chronology
do.
that I've just shown you, do you accept that that is correct?
With some distinctions.
Well, what are the distinctions?
Well, the distinction, first of all, well, is not related to the chronology, but it is worth asking
No,
you for clarification. Well, to answer your question, I would require some elucidation on your part.
On the question, you want the question elucidated?
I would like to know, well, yes, please, then, what are you asking precisely?
I'm asking, do you accept as a foundational principle that there we have an example of something that has ended up in your report as a fact, which has in fact simply circulated from the Serbian media as the source?
So, first, well, you began your question by saying the Serbian state, and now you're
If
saying...
I did, then that was just,
I believe that you did.
Well,
To answer your question, first of all, I would want to know what media. Because in our work, we did make a distinction between the state-run media and, no, excuse me,
I'm sorry.
Your Honor, there are many ways of interrupting the
Just a
witness.
second. Mr. Emerson, please, let him finish his question. You're interrupting him?
I didn't interrupt it.
Yes, you did.
4 times.
that we make a distinction between within the media, because the state had a strong control over some media outlets, and there were also more independent media outlets, which means we would place a higher degree of credibility on those outlets. So I would want to know, first of all, what media they were referring to.
Yes, and you don't say in your report it's cited to any particular media or to any media at all or to Serbian media. They say that. You don't. You say you cite to them. Correct?
That is correct.
And you told us yesterday, you gave a long evidence about how, because it was the Humanitarian Law Centre, you could trust the reliability of their conclusions.
I have a high degree of faith
In their conclusions.
in their methodology.
Very well. So you had a high degree of faith in their methodology. So in this instance, what does that mean? Your high degree of faith is that they must have only relied on reliable media.
That is my assumption and my belief, yes.
And yet it becomes a statement of fact in your account without any indication it's just the recycling of a newspaper report.
We placed a degree of faith in the Humanitarian Law Center. We believed they had reasons to include this report. I don't recall if I had conversations with the researchers or the authors of their report about this particular case.
Or did you just lift the facts because you wanted to make your law report look balanced, and so you thought, well, we haven't been focusing on the KLA, there's a bit there, we'll just take the facts and cut and paste them into our report in different language? Because that's effectively what's happened, isn't it?
I don't agree with that assessment.
Okay. Let me ask you this, and I don't think I need to call it up, but I'll be guided by the bench. I'm simply thinking about speed. This is from your own witness statement to the prosecution here, which I think you self-wrote, didn't you?
So the witness statement to...
That you have given to the Specialist Prosecutor's Office in these proceedings.
The initial draft I wrote, correct.
Yes. And I'm reading from paragraph 13, which is 13 of his witness statement, which is dated 20th of April 2020. It reads as follows: all of the research conducted by HRW between 1990 and 1999 shared a common methodology. Trained and experienced researchers interviewed victims and witnesses of abuses, usually in lengthy one-on-one interviews. Multiple sources with corroborative evidence were required to make credible claims, and Human Rights Watch erred on the side of caution when making allegations public. Whenever possible, Human Rights Watch got information from alleged perpetrators, whether it was a government or non-state actor. That's your statement of your methodology in the preparation of these reports. And that's the basis on which you have presented yourself to this court in order to assess the reliability of what you say. Now, we've looked at that last example where it's a recycled Serbian news report in your report, and then where in the subsequent report you cite these things back to yourself. In other words, no longer the involvement of the media, even the involvement of the Humanitarian Law Centre, is concealed, because now it's Human Rights Watch citing back.
Okay, I object again. Continuing commentary, there need to be questions asked
There
of the
are
witness
questions,
one at a
as you well
time
know.
without the commentary.
Thank you. The motion is sustained. Please put a question in every once in a while so that we know what you're doing.
Now, my question is, and it's, I would have thought patently obvious what the question is. The passage...
It isn't to me, and
well,
therefore it isn't to the witness.
Very well. The passage in your witness statement that I've just read to you, where you talk about the need for multiple sources with corroborative evidence and lengthy one-on-one interviews with victims and witnesses, that is not reflected, is it, in the passage, in the inclusion in your report of something which is taken from the media by another NGO without any additional evidence and then reproduced in your report citing to the NGO. The two are not compatible, are they?
Yeah,
All right.
Could you
Let me
please
make
just ask him a
let me make it
straightforward
very-
question
well,
so that we can move on with
I'm
this?
bound to say I feel these interruptions and the rulings on them are not designed to make this clearer or more easy, but are designed to obstruct. May I please cross-examine the witness? It's not lengthy.
You may, but you need to ask questions.
Yeah, well, I am
not
asking
make
questions.
speeches.
I'm not making a speech. I'm asking a question. I mean, in a sense, the aim, if the witness objects to answering the question, Mr. Teager is on his feet and the bench sustains the objection. And all I'm trying to do is make a very clear and obvious point, which is that the witness, I suggest, Mr. Abrahams, the use of that material from a news report through the Humanitarian Law Centre into your report is not consistent with the methodology you describe in your witness statement.
So I have described repeatedly how we approached that section of the report, which is, I believe, about, I think it's 11 pages of a 130-page report. We cite the sources that we used, and I have discussed how it was difficult and challenging to investigate allegations of KLA misconduct at that time due to fear and intimidation and the unwillingness of individuals to speak. So in our view, our mandate was best fulfilled by collecting the full compilation of cases from an assortment of reliable sources. And I also include here, it's not just Humanitarian Law Center, but I did interview, there's UNHCR, there's a foreign journalist, there were a couple of other sources in that 11-page section. And taken in their entirety, we believed that there was enough prevalence and enough of a pattern to justify us putting out these claims and putting out these abuses as they were alleged with the sourcing, so that people could go back and look at the sourcing as you have today, in order to make the point that these people are missing, also from ICRC, publicly known, some still missing today, and to enforce the point that while Serbian and Yugoslav forces were primarily responsible for the vast and overwhelming majority of abuses, the KLA was still beholden before the law, and we wanted to stress that point with what we believe to be credible information in order to promote our mandate of civilian protection.
Could you answer my question now, please? I'll read it to you again. The use of that material from a news report through the Humanitarian Law Centre into your report is not consistent with the methodology you describe in your witness statement, is it?
Objection asked and answered. I think the witness just responded to that question.
Well, he didn't respond to the question. It's the question, I'll put it again.
Overruled, you may answer the question.
Yes. Is it consistent with your claimed methodology?
It is a different methodology, yes.
So when you say all of the research in your statement conducted by Human Rights Watch shared a common methodology, and then you describe it, that part of your statement is not true, is it?
Can you reread my statement?
All of the research conducted by Human Rights Watch between 1990 and 1999 shared a common methodology. Trained and experienced researchers interviewed victims and witnesses of abuses, usually in lengthy one-to-one interviews and so forth.
I believe it's consistent because I'm laying out the methodology that we perform. I said usually. I believe it says usually.
It says all of the research.
Yep. Well, can you pull up the statement?
Yes, of
so
course,
I may...
of course. Do we have a P number for this? Yeah? So just give us a moment. See why I'm trying to do it a little bit more quickly, because these things take some time. So it's 07552. Sorry, 5552. 0755552. Right. First of all, do you recognise your signature, Mr. Abrams?
Yes, I do.
Right. So is that your witness statement?
Based on the first page, yes, it is.
Yes. You think you might be? Do you want to look at every page? Your signature on the bottom of every page? Is that what you're implying?
No.
No, let's move then to 075556, paragraph 13. Could you read out for us, please, the first 5 words of paragraph 13?
All of the research conducted by HRW between 1990 and 99 shared a common methodology. Trained and experienced researchers interviewed victims and witnesses of abuses, usually in lengthy one-on-one interviews. Shall I continue?
Yes, please.
Multiple sources with corroborative evidence were required to make credible claims, and Human Rights Watch erred on the side of caution when making allegations public.
All right, pausing there. That's not a proper description, is it, of how you have adopted, in the one instance I've taken you to, a report from the Humanitarian Law Centre?
Correct.
Excuse me, but I think it's important to note that there is a witness preparation note provided to the defense, which did clarify.
I'm sure that's
this-
appropriate for re-examination. I'm not quite sure why it's an interruption to my cross-examination. If you wish to re-examine.
My understanding of the question is the witness is being drawn to alleged contradictions between the methodology he described in his statement and what appears in the reports, and that has been addressed during the course of the process by the witness.
So I'll overrule it at this time. You can address it on redirect if necessary. Go ahead.
Well, you may answer the question then, Mr. Abrahams. The passage you've just read out does not accurately describe the methodology I have just shown you this morning, where you take something cited to the media, Serbian media, by the Humanitarian Law Centre, and then cite the Humanitarian Law Centre, and then repeat it and cite back to your own report.
So I think I want to make a distinction because, you know, when we conduct investigations into cases, we pursue this methodology to the best of our abilities. And I believe I have explained that the 11 pages of the report you're referencing, which is different from the other reports, the later reports, which rely on primary resources.
We'll come to that in a minute.
Primary sources, that this report used, for reasons I've explained, secondary sources such as the Humanitarian Law Center. So that explains the difference between what you are pointing out and my statement here.
Yes, but obviously, I mean, you will accept for the court to place weight on anything in your reports, I'm sure. The source used by the Humanitarian Law Centre is going to be important, correct?
Well, that's a question for the court.
Well, all right, let me put it another way. Would you accept that when a statement is made by you based on the Humanitarian Law Centre report, it makes a difference whether they've interviewed the witness and had lengthy one-to-one interviews with them, corroborative evidence and so forth, or whether they've just pulled down something from the Serbian media?
I mean, so first I just want to make a point. I am not comfortable with the term Serbian media.
That's the term used in the HLRC report.
Okay, I cannot speak to how the HLC has described it. I would not use that term because it is applying an ethnic description to a media outlet. And there are distinctions within the media that is based in Serbia. So that's one point that I do feel strongly about.
Yes,
I'm sorry now, I'm going to rise. I really apologize, but there is a provision in the Order of Conduct to Proceedings regarding courtesy in court. I think that precludes eye-rolling and utterances while the witness is speaking.
Right.
Sustained.
I accept that is not appropriate, but I don't understand why the comment is being made at this point.
Your physical actions interrupt the witness. It's the simplest way to say it. Please don't do that.
Okay. So, just to be clear on that, there may well be different qualities of Serbian media, and I'm sure you're absolutely right to say that. But we're talking here about what you were using as your source. and the source you used was the Humanitarian Law Centre. And unless I'm much mistaken, their report says source Belgrade Media, so Belgrade Media.
That's a geographic location and not an ethnic description.
Okay, very well, fine. If we use the term in my question, Belgrade Media, you won't feel uncomfortable.
No, it's not a question of comfort or discomfort. It's a question of accuracy and relevance.
Okay, well, you said it made you uncomfortable. That's why I used the word comfort. I mean, obviously,
Fair.
we can spend time on these things. But my question, to go back to the actual question I was asking you, is if it has come from the Belgrade Media into the Humanitarian Law Centre, it's going to be important to know, in evaluating the factual allegation, whether it is as a result of the methodology you describe Human Rights Watch adopting, i.e. interviewing the witness, or is simply recycling something from the Belgrade Media.
I apologize. I don't understand the question.
Well, in terms of the reliability of an assertion that you make, do you accept that an assertion following the interview of the witness is more likely to be credible, reliable, and true than something that is merely a recirculated media report?
Yes.
Thank you. So, looking again at your methodology as you described it, and as you just read out, do you agree with me that as we discussed yesterday, description in the 2001 report that you changed from the 1998 report is inconsistent with the methodology you describe?
I would say you're referring to the under orders.
I'm referring to the description where we looked at the two descriptions yesterday. In the one, it was dealt with totally fairly as a description of an allegation. By the end, with nothing having changed in between, the language used was assertive of a fact and of the criminal responsibility of the commander. And nothing had changed between the two. You remember that cross-examination yesterday?
Yes, I did.
Now, do you accept that's inconsistent with the methodology you describe? Because you say, I mean, to be specific, we would err on the side of caution when making allegations public, and here, on an entirely, without any basis whatsoever, you told us yesterday, you made a specific allegation with no information that had been any more detailed than the information you had when you had called it nothing more than a report.
Well, I wouldn't say there was nothing. There were people who went missing. There were people who are still missing today. But I do accept the phrase, as we discussed yesterday, the phrase in the under orders report was poorly constructed. And
not consistent, you accept, with the way you describe yourself as a careful, meticulous organisation.
No, I'm not satisfied with those, I believe, 2 lines in a 593-page report.
Yeah, well, the reference to what was considered a major incident, and in fact, one of the 2 cases that was ever prosecuted by the ICTY.
Okay, excuse me. I'm sorry, counsel. I apologize for that, but this has, as we've heard from both Mr. Emerson and the witness, this has been asked and answered and covered repeatedly.
Very well, let's move on to a different topic. Do you remember testifying in the Milutinovich case?
Generally, yes.
Yes. I mean, it need only be general, because you presumably kept a close eye on how Human Rights Watch's evidence in that case was received by the court.
At the time, yes.
Yes.
Today, my recollection is less clear of that.
No, I mean, I want to make it clear. I entirely accept that some of your materials are the product of genuine research, and we see that in particular in relation to the research that you did on the ground with your colleague, Mr. Bukert, in Drenica, following the terrible attacks in Gornia Obrinje, where you, I think, arrived on the scene the day after a massacre of Albanian civilians. Is that right?
That's correct. I believe it was 2 days after, but you are correct.
And can you give us a date for that investigation? When was it that you were there in Drenica?
Well, to the best of my recollection, the killings of the Lei family were on September 27th, and I remember my time and the suffering of that family intensely.
And I think, am I right in saying that you, this was in effect, this was part, therefore, of what has been perhaps inadequately described in public as the Serbian September offensive in '98. Is that right?
This event, this killing, this mass murder, occurred at the end, on the closing days of the Serbian offensive, which had begun some months before.
And I'm not sure whether I've asked you this already, but you arrived, at the time you arrived, the bodies were still in situ. Is that right?
Some of the bodies, I believe 7 of the 21 victims.
And it must have been a shocking and difficult experience for you. This was a pretty horrific scene that you arrived on. Is that right?
I have testified to that effect, yes.
Yeah. And could we just call up briefly the Week of Terror in Drenica, which is IT/05/87.1 P00753. Okay. Could we turn, I'm just going to take you to a couple of excerpts. Could we turn, first of all, to page 25 internally of the report, which should have the number 0364959 on the top. There we are. If we could just start at the bottom of the page, I'll just read this passage and a further passage in. The description that's given here, I think, is a description of literally what you saw as you arrived or when you were looking around the scene. It's almost a real-time narrative note, or narrative description. Is that fair?
You're speaking of the last paragraph?
Well, I mean, I think generally speaking, obviously you mix, reported speech, as for example in the previous paragraph, with your own observations. But just by the way this is worded, about 60 feet down the forest path from Ali's body was the temporary shelter. I mean, that's you observing that at the time, isn't it?
That is correct.
Yeah. So you're not basing that on any hearsay or any reporting. You're there on the ground and you're almost a crime scene investigator. Is that right? I mean, you're doing it for different purposes, but you're there investigating exactly what has happened in the freshest way possible.
I believe the methodology is included in this report, and it explains our presence in the location
Yeah,
at
but
that
could you
time.
explain it to the judges then? Just
What's-
exactly what I was just asking you.
Yeah, so, well, we arrived at the scene, it was either a day or a day after this attack, and witnessed the 7 of the 21 bodies in this location in the forest as they were being carried out for burial.
If we can just then, under that heading, about 60 feet down the forest path from Ali's body was the temporary shelter the Delilai family had constructed in the forest, a wooden frame with a green tarp covering 3 foam mattresses. Just pausing there for a second, this was a family that had fled their homes and taken refuge from the Serbian offensive in the forest.
Correct. They were from the village,
Yeah.
so it was in the vicinity of their home.
Is near, yeah, but away from. So but they were hiding basically.
Correct.
Human Rights Watch saw that the middle mattress was soaked with blood, and that a human brain remained on the mattress on the left side of the shelter. According to diplomatic observers and journalists who visited the scene, while all of the bodies were
Excuse
still...
me, scroll the page, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. According to diplomatic observers and journalists who visited the scene, while all of the bodies were still in the forest, the bodies of Heva Delilai, a 62-year-old woman, and Pajazit Delilai, a 69-year-old man, were found in the tent. These sources described Hava Delilai as having a gunshot wound to the head and a cut throat. The diplomatic sources further observed that Hava's right foot was almost severed from the body, apparently in an attempt to remove the foot with a knife. Pajazit was nearly decapitated, with his brain fully removed from the cranium and lying next to his body. There's then a direct quote from an interview with Zenina Delilai on what she found when she opened the tent, and we can see she describes the left head, the left side of Pajazit's head as having been missing, brain in the mattress and so forth. The mattress is filled with blood and so on. So that's although you could see some of this for yourself, this was the person saying, when I first got there, this is what I found. So it directly, I mean, essentially you were corroborating the on-the-scene descriptions yourself, correct?
Yes, we spoke with those individuals who had been there prior to us.
Yes, exactly. And then if we turn perhaps a little further down to, it should be page 29, I think, which should have 364963 on it, under the heading Zahida Delilai and her two daughters. Now, we're still in the forest. It's the same family, the extended family. Is that right?
The Delilai family, yes.
So Zahide, it's pronounced Delia?
Delilai.
Delilai. Zahide Delilai and her two daughters, Donieta and Genchana. On top of the thickly wooded gully, Human Rights Watch saw three more bodies. Zahida Delilai, 27, was found at the edge of the gully, apparently shot as she was trying to climb out. A bullet had shot away the back of her head. Zahida was only wearing socks, not shoes, suggesting that she may have been resting in the tent at the time of the attack. Her two daughters lay dead immediately behind her. 5-year-old Donieta had an apparent gunshot wound that had removed part of the right side of her face. Sorry. 5-year-old Donieta had an apparent gunshot wound that had removed part of the right side of her face. 7-year-old Genchiana had the top of her head removed, apparently by a bullet. So, again, this is not you summarising what you've been told. You're actually seeing this and recording what you've seen.
That's correct.
Yeah. And last passage I want to go to is on page 26 of the internal pagination, K036490 at the bottom of the page, and we have to, if you start the last few lines. So this is Hamidi, Jeton, Lulieta, and Valmir Delilai. A group of 4 bodies was found by family members, diplomatic observers, and journalists a few feet up the narrow gully. This group included one of the youngest victims of the attack, 18-month-old Valmir Delilai found with a blood-spattered face. Yet on Delilai, a 9-year-old boy was found close by, reportedly with his throat cut from the jugular to the lower lip by a knife or bullet. And then there is an interview with Ima Delilai describing how the bodies were found initially. First of all, may I ask, were the bodies in situ, these bodies in situ, when you got there, or they weren't, or can't you remember?
I would have to spend time looking back at this report to give you an accurate.
But, I mean, you have a picture in your mind's eye of seeing babies dead on the scene, or had they already been taken away?
I recall whether there was a baby when we arrived, I do not
Very
recall.
well, very well. But there was a photograph that was taken at the crime scene, wasn't there, of the baby had been killed at close range in that way?
There was.
Yes. And we look a little bit further down in that description given to you by Ima Delilai, at the very bottom of the page, the other body was that of Valmir, the 18-month-old son of Adam. He had a wound on the right side of his face near his jaw, and on his right hand he had a hole, but not from a bullet, and other small wounds on his body. His pacifier was hanging on his chest. Now, I'm not going to make the obvious point that that is evidence where you're really in a position to describe what you saw. And obviously that's a completely different methodology from, for example, reporting from the media, clearly. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the media reporting of that incident. Because this is, your investigation of this went on for a matter of weeks, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. But and if we could just turn to internal page 63, that is K03650009, you describe how the Serbian media, and I'm sorry if to use that term is offensive, but that's how you describe it in the reports. You talk about Serbian television, so it may not be so offensive, it's your own words. If we look at the bottom of that page, page 63, okay. So this is the overall heading is about the response of the Yugoslav authorities, but you put together under that heading also the response of the Serbian, as you describe it, television channel RTS and others. So this is, if we use the term you were preferring before, Belgrade media, is that right? These are Belgrade media.
Since you raised the point, here Serbian television refers to the state television, which is distinctive and very different from independent media. And having investigated press freedom and published a report on press freedom in Serbia, I feel it's important to make a distinction and to respect the independent journalists who worked under extreme pressure during the Milosevic government.
And I entirely accept that there's a world of difference between independent media and state-run media, particularly in some countries. So that's an entirely legitimate point. And if I may say so, I'll try and use that distinction, because obviously the term Belgrade media could cover both, couldn't it?
Indeed.
Whereas Serbian television obviously is state-run media. But let's look at the state-run media. Most news programs on the official Serbian television, RTS, which is tightly controlled by the government, suggested that the Gornje Obrinje massacre had either been staged by Western media or by ethnic Albanian terrorists. The RTS Evening News even suggested that a widely publicised photograph of 18-month-old Valmir Delilai was actually a photograph of a doll, and the reporter held up what he claimed was a similar doll smeared with blood. Is that something you actually saw? You saw that happen? I mean, that doesn't perhaps matter, but did you watch that programme or a recording of it?
Yes, I did.
Must have made you extremely angry.
It was not surprising to see the propaganda, but it was very disturbing having seen what I saw in person.
Exactly. And I mean, without being pedantic about the detail, what you saw could only have been a massacre of civilians. There's no possibility of collateral damage. The nature of the injuries and the distribution of the people implies that whoever did that went in and systematically murdered people one by one, including women, elderly people, women, and very young children.
Our findings from this investigation were that there were very serious laws of war violations that resulted in the deaths of these civilians.
Yeah. And the Serbian, and I understand your point, the Serbian state media were making this allegation that it was a staged crime scene. It says just in the passage a little further down that researchers from Human Rights Watch gave interviews to the independent Serbian media of what they'd seen, such as Beta and Radio B92 and international journalists, but never were approached or by the state-run media. Is that's a correct summary, is it?
That's correct, and useful to stress this point of the difference between independent media and state media.
So can we just go back to the point? I mean, if I may say so, that has been recognised and held up as an example of the best of Human Rights Watch reporting. The court in Milutinovic singled it out as a classic example of admissible Human Rights Watch analysis. We'll come to that in a second. But if there's such a critical distinction between state media, which holds up a doll with fake blood on it as an illustration, and the independent media, and given that you told us that Belgrade media is a term that covers both, when you look at the Humanitarian Law Centre report, which cites the Belgrade media, how do you evaluate the reliability of their source?
Based on our faith and our belief in the methodology of the Humanitarian Law Center, which is in itself based on our personal interactions with them, our regular communications with them, and our firsthand knowledge of how they conduct their work.
But even the non-state media at the time existed on a spectrum, didn't they? There were much more independent, rigorous outlets than at one end of the spectrum and much closer to the state at the other end of the spectrum. Technically independent, but much more sympathetic to the state.
State-controlled and independent are non-nuanced ways to describe the full spectrum of media in Serbia at the time.
Yes, but I agree. But a nuanced way is to say that there was a spectrum of media with different degrees of proximity to the Serbian propaganda machine. Is that right?
There was media of all sorts who took different positions, also depending on the issues in relation to the state.
So it becomes critical to know, before evaluating something, what the media outlet was that's publishing a report. Would you agree with that?
Knowing the original source indeed helps to assess the veracity.
Well, I mean, this is a great example, isn't it? If it was state-run media, you wouldn't give it any credibility.
Correct.
If it was very strongly independent or international media, you would think that that was a potentially reliable strand of corroborative evidence.
We would be more likely to consider it.
Exactly. But with the range of in between, you could be dealing with something as equally or almost equally unreliable as state-run media, or as independent as the most independent groups.
Under other circumstances, I might let this process continue to go on, but there are time constraints today. this particular issue has been addressed repeatedly. The witness has made clear what factors they relied on, why. It's explained it multiple times.
Correct?
Sorry, Your Honor, that is correct.
Go ahead with the questioning, but we're getting towards the end.
Yeah, I will definitely be finished before the morning break, as I said. Yes, well, obviously, we're on an entirely different report here.
I understand.
All I'm simply asking is, you say that you cite the sources in your reports so that people can go back and check, just as I have done. That was your comment earlier on. My question is, if it simply says Belgrade Media, how does that make the person any the wiser as to the reliability of the source in the light of this kind of range of reporting?
So I cannot speak for the Humanitarian Law Center what decisions they made into how they footnoted their material. But we did have, and I still do have, a high degree of a high opinion and a high degree of faith in the work of the Humanitarian Law Center, knowing their methodology and their independent nature, having criticized Serbian and Yugoslav forces for many, many years, that they would make decisions that they believed based on material that they considered credible.
Coming back then to the Milutinovic case, the decision again is in our queue. I'm not sure that we need to bring it up at this stage, but I will if it's necessary. But you know that before you testified, there was litigation about which of your reports would go in evidence, don't you?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to what I understand to be the approaching line of questioning on relevance grounds.
Well, since it's an approaching line of questioning, it's premature.
That's not relevant. Go on. Go on with your questioning.
Yes, I'm sorry, the objection isn't relevant, or
I'm sustaining the objection.
that what isn't relevant?
The discussion of the litigation that went on beforehand. If you want to just ask him a straightforward question, ask him a
Okay,
straightforward question.
let me do it that way. Just give me a moment. In the evidence in that case, you testified about the preparation of this report, the report we just looked at. And as a result of that, I think you testified that obviously, as you testified here, it was the result of personal observation and intensive interviews of over 24 people with regard to a single incident. The single incident in the sense of the single compendious incident, this crime scene, the number of people within it, and so forth. And that the investigation into that one crime site by Human Rights Watch took what you described, I think, in your testimony as a matter of weeks, which is what I put to you earlier on. However, with respect to the under orders report, this is, of course, viewed from the Serbian defendant's perspective. In that case, it was a case against Serbian perpetrators. In relation to that, you testified, I think, and this is a quote from your testimony, that in relation to the allegations in under orders against Serbia for crimes falling within the Milutinovic indictment, that is to say, people, those who'd been the subject of the crimes against humanity or were described as victims of the crimes against humanity in the March to June period of 1999. Your testimony was these interviews, in a few cases, were quick. So you were interviewing people, but they were quick interviews, you said, because somebody was literally coming across the border in their tractor and we only had time to ask, where are you from and why are you leaving? That was the evidence that you gave in that case. Is that accords with your recollection?
Yes, well, I don't recall
The testimony,
the precise testimony, but that is what happened when we were in northern Albania at that time, I and colleagues, interviewing people fleeing or being expelled from Kosovo.
Yeah, and since the evaluation of the reliability of evidence and testimony is obviously an important part of your work, I mean, you would accept that there's a difference between those two, where you've done a several weeks investigation into a very specific crime site, and the situation where you've had often snatched interviews of refugees on their way out, in terms of the reliability and depth and credibility of what's being said.
There are two differences. One is obviously in the amount of time and intensity. The other is in the product that would stem from that investigation. So in this case, the former is a detailed report, gathering all of that research. But we would, but the interviews briefly done from people fleeing would be compiled together. We would not use that information to present a report based on a person who was in haste and in trauma telling us what had happened.
So that's an important distinction. So you're saying you wouldn't describe the event, for example, that they're describing to you as they rush past you, so to speak, at the border into Macedonia, for example. You wouldn't describe particular events, but you'd look at the pattern of what seemed to be consistent stories. Is that right?
So, I mean, we would have to speak about specific incidents.
Yes. No, I'm asking about your general methodology, actually.
Yes, no, but generally, that second case of interview would feed into a larger body of work, and we require interviews to gather a fuller, complete picture of what had happened.
But you going back to this distinction between what you're doing and what an investigator or a court of law is doing, you're not preparing this for the purposes of evidence, are you? This is not intended as evidence.
I'm sorry, preparing what? These
Reports. But for example, the under orders report, which, as you know, because you will have followed it up, was excluded from the evidence in Milutinovic, on the basis that it wasn't as in-depth as the other one. My point is, in doing that, when you put a report like that together, it's not intended that you would be, that the report would be relied on in evidence, because you're not doing any of the things that an investigator would otherwise do, are you, in the latter case?
So our public publications of any sort have a variety of goals. The ultimate one being civilian protection in times of war, and the promotion and protection of human rights generally. Beneath that goal it depends on the situation, and it's to inform the public and generate public pressure. It's to inform...
Public pressure to do what?
For policymakers...
Just a second. Don't interrupt. Let him finish the question, then you can ask him the follow-up. Go ahead, sir.
I can, well, continue, which is public pressure on policymakers, on politicians, to promote and implement and pursue policies that are respectful of human rights. And so our reporting always had that as its aim.
Would it also, and we can look at some examples if you like, but would it also have the aim of spurring international criminal prosecutors to investigate?
Accountability.
Yes.
I would say accountability is a clear and articulated goal of our organization.
But more specific than accountability, you're also urging in some of these reports that, at least as regards the period of 1998 up to the end of the war in June 1999, that Carla Del Ponte, then prosecutor of the ICTY, should investigate those allegations.
Correct.
that were not already under investigation, specifically those allegations that were circulating about the Kosovo Liberation Army?
We have long supported international criminal proceedings to investigate and, as appropriate, prosecute serious allegations of violations. Absolutely.
But that's because your work is not intended to substitute for an investigation. It's intended to, if you like, raise the fact that there are things to investigate.
Our job is to present as credible a body of evidence as we can, to encourage rights-respecting policies, including accountability and justice.
I want to look at one aspect of that with you briefly. There are two generalized areas of evidence in this case that you have given evidence about, but not sought to present as a finding or a conclusion. There are things I wanted to just explore with you. The first relates to your evidence about the reasons why certain Albanian witnesses you spoke to might have been reluctant to testify. And you gave us fear, loyalty to the cause, I think was the expression, or a combination of both. I suppose we could add, or they've got nothing relevant to tell you. There's another reason why someone might not say anything. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second is whether the action in June, the attacks that you were aware of, and I think your colleague did some first-hand, more meticulous research. Is it Ben Ward?
Correct.
Yeah. On Serb civilians and others who were the victim of a rush of attacks when the refugees returned and the war was technically the Kumanabro agreements had been concluded. And you gave a description to the court about, and you gave a description in one of your reports about the relative likelihood that this was individuals with patches sewn on just to pretend they're KLA, with other private individuals, or with small groups of KLA or individual KLA members acting outside authority, or with the authority of the zone commanders. Those were the options that you looked at. And you've expressed some opinions about that. And I just want to go through the process, because obviously to be useful, we have to try and put some metric on your generalization. I don't mean that's pejoratively, on the general conclusions that you're drawing. So let's look at the first group, first of all. The reasons for Albanian witnesses or people you were interviewing being reluctant to talk. Presumably you're not first of all, you wouldn't have kept a record of that, would you, to say, well, this one was not doing it through fear, or this person said that. You wouldn't have kept a numerical record as to how many of the Albanian people that you spoke to were unwilling to talk about you wouldn't have quantified it.
To the best of our ability, we kept notes to reflect our work on the ground.
Sure, but would you have quantified the number of people as a proportion of the overall Albanian people that you spoke to who seemed to you to be unwilling to testify or give evidence, give an account?
Well, we did not conduct a quantitative analysis.
There's no quantitative analysis, exactly. That's exactly the point I'm making. When I say an objective a metric, that's what I'm referring to. But equally, presumably, with any one individual, it's going to be difficult, unless they say something specific, to know whether it's fear, whether it's loyalty, or whether it's both.
In some cases, for sure, it would be difficult.
Yeah,
to
in
assess.
most cases, if they're not talking to you. Unless somebody says, the only reason I don't want to talk to you is I'm on their side, or the only reason I don't want to talk to you is somebody will threaten to kill me. Means you have no way of knowing, do you, or it's just impressionistic, is it?
No, it's more nuanced than that, because how someone conveys their willingness to share information can tell you a lot. And it's not a guessing game. Sometimes they let you understand in ways nonverbal,
Yeah.
or it is also part of my job to understand and interpret the context in which we are working.
Sure, but if somebody's not willing to discuss it with you, it's going to be hard to get to the bottom of which of those motives or a combination of them it is.
It sometimes yes, and
Yeah.
sometimes no.
Exactly. So we can say that well, I'm sure you can say categorically that there were people you came across for whom you judged that the overwhelmingly important motive for not willing to cooperate was fear. There were some people in that category.
Definitely.
And were there people in the opposite, in one of the other categories that you could judge the overwhelming reason was that they were Albanian and were not prepared to say anything bad about their own side?
Yes.
But within that category, you couldn't tell if they had anything bad to say or not.
Within the second category, people who believed in the cause.
Well, if you wouldn't know whether they were concealing something or just... I mean, the implication of this analysis is that people are holding back from telling you something potentially damaging to their own side. But of course, that presumes that there's something damaging particularly that they have to tell you.
So the answer to your question is also from the other direction, which is that we encountered many cases. I encountered many cases where people also tended to exaggerate because of the cause.
Yes.
And saying things that they felt was promoting, drawing attention to the suffering of the ethnic Albanian people, which was a real suffering, but in ways that didn't always reflect the facts on the ground. So that's why our investigations had to be cautious and ask details of them about where they were. Did they see something themselves? Were they present? But that was a common challenge when documenting the Serbian and Yugoslav abuses.
So, again, all I'm trying to do at this stage is to work out if there's anything in any of this that helps to give a metric or a quantification on that issue, whether of how many of the Albanian people that you spoke to, and you must have spoken to thousands or hundreds at least.
At least hundreds,
Yes.
at least.
Because, of course, many of them were testifying about crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Serbian campaign. So that issue didn't arise in that context, I suppose.
It did.
It did as well.
Yes,
So there could be
it did.
fear of reprisals by the Serbs. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is to make as accurate as possible an assessment of an IHL violation required also understanding the location and activity of the armed group, in this case, the KLA. And often, not always, but we found some interviews were reluctant to speak about that and would say things like, no, they were nowhere in the area.
Sure.
So we had to dig into those claims.
I see, but you can't tell if somebody it's a perfect example. In the example you give, you don't know whether they're saying, you might later be able to just prove that, I think you mentioned an instance in one of your reports, where you actually knew there had been KLA in that area at that time, and therefore you could deduce that the witness was either didn't know that, which perhaps strains, as it seems unlikely, or knew it and didn't want to tell you.
Correct.
Which they have obviously no obligation to do.
And sometimes we knew that going into these interviews.
Yes. But my question is, how do you decide whether that person is, I mean, they may not want to tell you about the military movements of the KLA or who was where or what was what, but how do you know, or are you not saying you know, that they have anything to say which could be relevant to a crime against humanity?
Well, in some cases, we were able to discern, or I could discern, that there was a fear involved. either said it or, more likely, made it be known in nuanced ways that I'm not going to discuss this.
Yes, but they may say, I'm not going to discuss it, but what's the it?
Alleged misconduct by the KLA.
I see. So you would ask them, people generally, we're investigating a KLA, an alleged KLA atrocity or crime in this area, and they would say to you, I don't want to talk to you about that at all. I won't discuss it with you.
So either that, or they would say, I don't know about that.
Yes.
Yes, but the way in which that is communicated can mean that there is a reason behind it. It can, and we're speaking.
But could you just explain? I mean, obviously, someone can write, can signal with or put a sign in front of them saying, "I know everything, but I'm too afraid to tell you." But I mean, they can signal in some way. What are you talking about? Can you give us an example of how, when a witness says, "I don't know anything about that," how do you evaluate when it's done non-verbally, as you said, which I think you say are the majority of cases? More likely, you said. More likely it would be done non-verbally, so that's what your evidence was a minute ago. So my question is, can you give us an example of how that might happen, or maybe a demonstration? Is it a signal, a sign, a wink, or something?
So I think I'm going to answer that question by stepping back, because, I mean, the best way I can explain it is that there was a highly intense, politicized, and fearful environment, generally, given the war.
Exactly. Yes,
And that, broadly speaking, my experience from 1996 until 2001 is that investigating crimes by the KLA was more challenging. It was distinctly more challenging, which is not unique to Kosovo. And we see it. I've worked in about a dozen armed conflicts. And for a spectrum of reasons, from loyalty to fear to intimidation to instruction to understanding of instruction, individuals are less likely to share information about their own quote-unquote side, despite perhaps disagreement, concerns about their conduct, concerns about whether their conduct is also putting them at risk from retaliation by other forces. For example, do not conduct military activity in the vicinity of a civilian area because you are making us vulnerable to counterattack.
I mean, put in that way, it's an explanation for the challenges that you faced in getting a thorough picture out of that community in that period, because A, there was a war going on up until June of 1999, but then you were dealing with the aftermath, correct, where law and order took considerable time to be re-established under UNMIK, I think. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So you wouldn't be suggesting from any of that that people were, that there's a proportion of people who were, for example, withholding from you key information or information about the commission of crimes?
I believe there were people who did withhold information.
You believe it?
Yes. No,
by their reaction in not telling you?
And also there were people who said, I will not talk about that.
Yes.
So I'm very confident in stating that there were cases, and I cannot give you a percentage.
Exactly.
Yes, I cannot give you
I
that
mean,
percentage.
it could be one incident.
No, it's not one incident.
So,
no, it could not be one incident.
Okay, fine. Could it be 10?
I don't feel in a position to give a concrete number like that, but I will say in the full spectrum of our work, more than 10.
Yes. I mean, I apologise for pressing you, and it may seem obtuse to press you, but it's important for the judges to know what can be inferred from the evidence that you've given. And essentially, you're presumably unwilling to express a view of the percentage of Albanians you interviewed from whom it was clear that they were able to tell you about something relevant to a crime and were withholding it for the predominant reasons of fear rather than loyalty?
I'm sorry, I would,
Well, I'll read it out to you again.
sorry.
You are presumably unable or unwilling to express a view of the percentage of Albanians you interviewed, and I mean by that you collectively, Human Rights Watch, from whom it was clear that they were able to tell you about something relevant to a crime, but were withholding it for the predominant reason of fear rather than loyalty.
Objection asked and answered.
No, it was asked and
Oh,
specifically
overruled.
asked to be repeated.
You may answer the question.
I cannot give you a quantified number.
Exactly, or even in a percentage.
A percentage? No, I'm not in a position to give you a numeric
No, thank
number.
you. Thank you. So I want now to just look at other issues where, I mean, it doesn't make the evidence on any of these things less relevant. It gives it its proper shape. And then I want to ask you, relatedly, using a sort of similar approach, about the pattern that you described based on Ben Ward's research of mistreatment of Serbs and minorities at the time of the influx of returning refugees and others post-Kumanova. Okay? Is I still saw you furrowing your brow, but that's the period I'm asking you to focus on for a moment. Now, can we call up your witness statement, please? Which again, I just read. We've done it once before, but I'll read it. It's not his witness statement. Yeah, thank you. It's 075552. This is the witness statement that you self-drafted, and then there was some discussion with the SPO, dated April of 2019. Now, could we turn to paragraph 79, which is on? I think, yeah, it's page 60. Page 16. Right. Okay. Yes. You say there, I reviewed and edited the Human Rights Watch report entitled Abuses Against Serbs and Roma in the New Kosovo, dated August 1999, which was authored by Ben Ward. This report states, inter alia, in part, the following. Ethnic Albanian civilians have taken part in much of the burning and looting of Serb and Roma property. Now, pausing there, as you understood it as the editor, civilians means civilians in that sentence. It means non-combatants.
Correct.
And that's not because this is after the end of the war. You're saying people who were just civilians, no connection to the KLA.
This would refer to non-KLA members.
Exactly. Because it's, I mean, in a sense, would you agree that there were a lot of civilians directly participating in hostilities during the conflict who were fighting alongside KLA or without uniforms in their village, but they were loyal to the KLA?
Well, I think you're more learned in IHL than I, but when a civilian takes up arms and is actively contributing or participating,
they're no
in
longer a
hostilities,
civilian.
They're no
Exactly.
Longer, they lose their
exactly.
civilian status.
But here you mean civilians proper, because we're after the conflict. This is after the ceasefire. Yeah?
They are not members of the KLA, is what is intended to mean.
Exactly. So ethnic civilians have taken part in much of the burning and looting of Serb and Roma property, and in a few instances in violent attacks on their neighbours. returning refugees, many of whom lost their own property through theft and arson prior to June, have been particularly implicated in the expulsion of Serb and Roma from their home. Now, again, returning refugees means civilians, doesn't it?
In this context, yes.
Yes. Yes, I meant it specifically, yes. So we're talking about civilians having been involved in much of the burning and looting, and some only of the violent attacks. And we're talking about civilians also having been involved in the expulsions of Serbs from their homes. Correct?
Correct.
Again, metric, can you give us an idea? What does much of it mean? How much of it would you say numerically, or can't you say?
I would have to go back in depth
Yes.
to this report.
There's clearly a difference intended between much and some, isn't there? The words
Indeed.
are meant to imply a greater degree in one proportion than another.
Correct.
Yeah. So at least we can say they made a significant contribution. Civilians were responsible for a significant part. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
Yes, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah. Would you say that, as far as you can recall, you're trying to imply there that with the burning and the looting, not so much the attacks on people, but the burning and the looting and the driving out of Serb and Roma from their homes, that was more than half being done by civilians, or you just can't say?
Yeah, I would have to review this report with greater depth.
Sure, sure. The most serious incidents of violence, and I think, do you mean their violence against people in context? The most serious incidents of violence, however, have been carried out by members of the KLA.
Sorry, the next sentence.
Yeah.
The most serious incidents, however, have been carried out by members of the KLA. Yes, sorry, what is the question?
First of all, is that, you were talking about violence, if you look at the preceding sentence, is that violence against people or violence against property?
I would, again, I'd have to look back, but I'm assuming from this it's people.
I see. And when you say the most serious, do you mean that's not a numerical comment, is it? You're not saying the majority. You're saying some, but the more serious ones, the murder, because one or two, or so, I think it's, would you agree, less than 10 instances of murder cited in that report, or you can't remember?
Again, I really
But it's in that kind of number, isn't it? It's the single digits.
Well, there are, I mean, I'm familiar with a couple of the major incidents.
Yes.
In which there were multiple, I mean, one
Yes.
incident that
Yes.
resulted in multiple deaths. So I assume this refers
Is that
to that.
four? That's not the couple.
The interpreters kindly ask the speakers to make a pause between questions and answers. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
You know, there was one instance described in the report where there was two elderly couples, I think in Prizren, from recollection, and their husbands had gone out to get something from the market after having been harassed by people with KLA insignia, and then when they returned, they found their wives had been killed. Is that, you're not referring to that incident?
I don't recall.
No. But in any event, the general thrust of what you're saying is that there were some incidents, I mean, in the context of the conflict as a whole, a relatively small number of incidents in which it was believed that KLA soldiers had been involved, and that might have been because of uniforms, it might have been because they were known. Is that right?
To the best of my recollection,
Yeah.
there were some more prominent incidents post June that involved attacks. I believe there was one in Kosovo Polja. I believe there was one in Gračanica, if I'm not mistaken. There were two convoys that were attacked. Even one with K4 forces escorting Serbs out of Kosovo.
And
So
I think there was
to-
one in Bello-Polye as well. Is that right?
I don't recall that
But
specific.
in any event, there were a number of instances where it could be identified that serious violence against individuals had been perpetrated by people who were, let's just say, credibly assessed to be members of the KLA. Now, this is all happening in the relatively compact period between the 12th of June Kumanova Agreement for the withdrawal of Serbian forces from Kosovo. And, I mean, this report is dated in August, I think. But in September, as you know, the Kosovo Liberation Army was disbanded and disarmed. So those are the bookends of the period that we're talking about. Yes, I'm sorry. Pointed out to me that you're nodding, but it needs to go on the record. So could you just say yes in response to what I just asked you? We're dealing with I think I said we're dealing with a relatively short period between Kumanovo resulting in the withdrawal of Serbian forces and the date in September when the KLA was disbanded and disarmed.
I believe September 19th.
19. So yeah, it's a 3-month period.
Roughly, a tad more.
Yeah. And you've already explained that during that period there was a great deal of civilian damage to property that caused by civilians and so returning refugees and so forth. But those particular instances that you cited of KLA violence stood out. I just want to ask you some questions about that. First of all, I think we've already got your agreement on this proposition, but it is right, isn't it, that because the KLA was thought of as in that period as a sort of bit of a victor that delivered a form of independence to Kosovo and so forth, and you described that part of it, that people did try to claim to be members of the KLA or having been fighters when in fact it wasn't so clear.
I just pausing. I believe I said that there may have been cases where people did that. Yes.
I mean, there's an obvious motive for people to do that at a time where victory has been achieved in the sense that the Serb forces have been forced to withdraw, because when people look back, they want to see, they want to be able to claim, I was with the people who did this, not I was one of the people who was not willing to join.
So I think there are two responses to that question. One is, no doubt, there were individuals who exaggerated their role in the struggle. And at the same time, I believed then, and I believe now, that to do so prominently also posed some risks, because the individuals who genuinely sacrificed would not
That's what you said.
tolerate fakes and masqueraders, or people who were trying to benefit from the popularity of the KLA more broadly.
I mean, in that context, with people claiming allegiance and so forth, claiming to have been more important than they were, I'm not at the moment suggesting that those are the people responsible for the limited number of incidents of killings, or the most serious ones, where you're suggesting, or your conclusion was that there was credible evidence that KLA soldiers were involved. But the real issue is, as you know, people could come and go from the KLA. We've heard evidence of it already from individuals. I mean, they might be a member of the KLA one day and then leave or come back later on and so forth. You know that's the way things operated.
No, I can't speak to that, but it's certainly possible there
Yeah.
was people coming and going.
Very well.
Just a second. Well, a pause, please.
Oh, gee.
If you'll go back and look at lines 4 through 25 of the previous line, you will see you are interrupting. I know you're doing it inadvertently, but you are interrupting the witness over and over again, and that's very difficult for the interpreters.
Well, I'm definitely going to try and avoid it. I'm afraid it is inadvertent.
I know it is,
shouldn't,
and
I shouldn't,
but I'm reminding you of it because it's very difficult for the interpreters.
well, I'm not a spring chicken and I shouldn't be making those mistakes anymore, but I apologize. All right, so just getting a sense of all that, but we're dealing, aren't we, with a period June to September when KLA forces were all returning to their homes, as well as the civilians.
Correct?
Yeah. So you had people who were in the process of returning home, who had been KLA members, perhaps serving in a completely different part of Kosovo, but were now returning to their towns and villages.
I think, first, largely, but not exclusively, KLA fighters served in the regions from where they came.
Yes.
And some of them may not have left their homes, but some may have, so I can't speak precisely to that.
If we can just go back to your witness statement, and I'm picking it up again in paragraph 79, in the quote from the Human Rights Report, you say, halfway down that paragraph, the most serious incidents of violence, however, have been carried out by members of the KLA. Although the KLA leadership issued a statement on July the 20th condemning attacks on Serbs and Roma, and KLA political leader Hashim Thaçi publicly denounced the July 23rd massacre of 14 Serb farmers, it remains unclear whether these beatings and killings were committed by local KLA units acting without official sanction, or whether they represent a coordinated KLA policy. Stopping there, because you go on to say KLA should be doing something to investigate and prevent, which we'll come back to. But it's what I want to explore with you is it remains unclear whether these beatings and killings were committed by local KLA units acting without official sanction, or whether they represent a coordinated KLA policy. Now, it's that question of coordinated KLA policy that I want to focus on with you, because you've already told us that right the way through, including at this time, if there was authorization for activity in the zones, it would be the zone commander who would have the autonomy to authorize or prevent that. You've told us all yesterday all about how powerful the strongly willed independent zone commanders were, and how, therefore, to that extent, these things were decentralized. You're not suggesting, I presume, because you've already told us you're not making any allegations of crimes committed by any of the people in this courtroom, you're not suggesting there that it remained unclear whether it was a coordinated KLA policy at general staff level. That's not a suggestion you're making, is it?
What we're saying here, or in this, from the report from 95, is at the time, it was unclear to us to what extent these attacks and violence, beatings and killings were committed and authorized by local forces or coordinated policy, yes, at the center, including at the general staff. At the time, it was unclear. And we did not have evidence at the time to say that it did stem from that.
And you're not, and again, when you spoke to for example, Mr. Thaçi, your point was they've made these strong statements disparaging, criticising and so forth, but they need to do more because there seem to be acts of lawlessness breaking out everywhere, and some of them, perhaps a limited number, but some of the worst, seem to be being committed by people who were KLA in uniform.
So our position at the time, and still today, is that the prevalence, the persistence, and the intensity of the crimes being committed at that time obligated a response from the still existing KLA because it had risen to the level where the onus is on the parties to the conflict,
Yes.
although the conflict had officially ended by
Exactly,
June
yeah.
12th, that the onus was on them to at least investigate
Yeah.
and, as appropriate, take steps to minimize, mitigate,
Understand.
and deal with these
Yes,
abuses.
and that's what you go on to say in the next page. What is indisputable, however, and if we just go over the page, is that the frequency and severity of such abuses make it incumbent on the KLA leadership to take swift and decisive action to prevent them.
Correct.
You go on then in your statement to say, to qualify, I remember I put it to you yesterday, you qualified that finding by reference to things you'd read in the Dick Marty report, and you said absolutely not. And I just want to check then, perhaps something got misunderstood here. I think this is if it just let us read through. This report was compiled using the same methodology described above, and I believe it was accurate when written. With regard to the sentence, it remains unclear whether these beatings and killings were committed by local KLA units acting without official sanction, or whether they represent a coordinated KLA policy. Sorry. The degree of coordination was not clear to me back then, but over time it became clearer from other research, including the findings in the Marty report, that the violence was to a significant extent coordinated. So just to be clear, I mean, with respect, you're not here as an expert witness, and so whatever views you may have had changed from reading other things is perhaps not the crucial question. But you obviously know that some of the central findings in the Dick Marty report have, let's put it this way, after extensive multi-year investigation, been found not to have not been pursued. For example, there's no evidence or allegation in any court in this jurisdiction or domestically of the use by the KLA of or the central, most notorious allegation of organ trafficking. So I'm just saying that my question to you is, at the time you were clear that there was insufficient material to suggest it was coordinated activity at a policy level. Are you seeking to undermine that now?
My answer to this question will require a little explanation, if you will grant me
Yes,
that.
of course.
Do we have time before the break, Your Honors?
Well, it depends how long you need.
No, that should be more than adequate, yes.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just concerned. I'm going to stop in 10 minutes, and so that'll be the end of my questions. Rather than push you into that now, my question for you really simply, without a 10-minute explanation, is at the time, that was the official position of Human Rights Watch, correct?
What was the official?
As it's described in the...
Correct.
Yeah. And whatever you've learnt since then, is material that you've read by somebody else?
Not correct.
Okay, could you tell us what the additional material is?
Gladly, and it won't take 10 minutes. So the key term here is other research. So by that, I'm referencing a list of things. First of all, our own research, because after this, this report from August, we published under orders, which includes additional material.
Correct.
And also on KLA crimes. And so this was further research that we conducted. In addition, there are the reports by international organizations. I'm thinking about as the OSCE's report, As Seen as Told, Volume 2, which addresses post-June abuses. I'm thinking about reports by Amnesty International and other credible international organizations. I'm thinking about reports that we obtained by UNMIC and by KFOR, which pointed very clearly to abuses by the KLA, despite political pressure, I believe, from the leadership not to speak about them. That's a separate issue. And now, I do want to address something where I disagree with your conclusion. It also includes the Dick Marty report. And I want to stress that the Dick Marty report was not the end of the story. The Dick Marty report led to the creation of the European Union's Special Investigative Task Force. It was a direct result of the SITF, which was, please, I just need to finish this thought, one more minute, which was run by a senior American diplomat, in fact, a former war crimes ambassador in the State Department named Clint Williamson, who also served as the director of justice in UNMIC in 1999. And if you look at Mr. Williamson's concluding statement, the result of the SITF in, I believe, 2014, it says very clearly that their findings were, and I don't want to quote, we can check the statement, but we can check the statement, were largely consistent with the findings of the Dick Marty report. So they interviewed hundreds of people, the SITF. They found an atmosphere of intimidation regarding these crimes. No, I just need to finish my answer, if I may, sir. Thank you. And regarding, because you raised the organ trafficking, what they said, I'm referring to the SITF state, what you said.
I'm sorry, I am going to interrupt just for a moment to address the bench, please.
Just a moment. I'll give you 5 extra minutes when...
Yes, I'm concerned also that we're now the witness is traversing into the forerunner institutions to the SPO. And the fact that, well, the Bart Williamson investigation, the Special Investigative Task Force, is what led to the establishment of the SPO. The case of the SPO is the case that's before us, not what...
Just wrap it up, please.
Yes, sir. The point I'm making is because you claimed that the organ trafficking allegations had been dismissed. I think you said not pursued.
Not pursued.
Not pursued, which is not accurate. Well, the SITF did pursue them. And what they found was there were, I believe I am quoting directly, compelling indications of a handful of cases. But what remains are 400 missing persons post-June. So that is, when I speak about other research, that's the full body of research to which I am referring.
All right, thank you, witness. Go ahead, Mr. Emerson.
For various reasons, I'm not going to engage with the suggestion that it's appropriate for introduction of Bart Williamson's conclusions about issues that have then been investigated by the SPO and not pursued, which is exactly the proposition that I put to you. Let us move on. What I'm trying to establish with you is that in relation to this period, you are the description that is given in terms of coordination of a policy, you are not in a position in relation to any single incident, of whom there are a number, but they're still between 10 and 20 in total, right, to suggest that these were authorised at any level at all. They could have been unauthorised officials, unauthorised KLA members. They could have been authorised by their local commander. They could have just been an outcrop of violence by KLA enlisted, it's called KLA most junior fighters, or they could have been authorised in a zone or at zone level. There is no evidence that you can produce, I suggest, of anything beyond that.
What I'm saying here is that based on the accumulated research that was produced subsequent to the 1999 report, I, having read those, came away with the conclusion that there was a higher degree of coordination than I had believed and we had concluded at first.
Obviously, the matter for submissions, but it's not for you to reach the conclusions about whether there's a central policy here. The last topic I want to touch upon with you, and it won't take a second or two because it follows on from these. In your reports on detentions and the under orders report, you stop calling any events that you're referring to, any acts of violence. You stop using the language of war crimes and you refer to them as post-conflict abuses. Can you just explain why that is?
I would have to look, but I take your word for it if we're changing the language. I mean, I can't speak to the particular passages. I would have to look at the context. But more broadly, the internal armed conflict came to an end on June 12th, 1999.
Exactly. And as a result, international humanitarian law ceased to apply and international human rights law became the applicable legal framework.
That's my understanding, correct?
And that was Human Rights Watch's understanding of the legal significance of the withdrawal following the Kumanova agreement.
To the best of my recollection, yes.
So, yes, so that international humanitarian law thereafter was not the appropriate body of law to be applied.
For crimes that were committed or alleged crimes post-June 1999. To the best of my knowledge, yes, that's correct.
And you describe or Human Rights Watch describes in one of the later reports how, although it had urged Carla Del Ponte to focus her attention on crimes committed by, at the time, prosecution alleged to have been committed by the KLA, and she had done so. She'd opened investigations into two sets of circumstances, at least. In October of 2000, you note that she applied to the Security Council, UN Security Council, for an extension of the mandate of the ICTY, correct?
Okay, I'm going to object, Your Honor. Now, I think we're getting into an area of relevance. This is not for the witness. There have been constant complaints earlier about opinion evidence. This falls in that category in relation to a legal issue.
May I respond?
Yes.
First of all, our complaints about opinion evidence were rejected, and therefore we're applying the rules that were imposed at that stage. And secondly, this organisation claims expertise in international humanitarian law. This witness claims expertise in international humanitarian law. The organisation concluded that the armed conflict ended on the 12th of June and that everything after that is not subject to international humanitarian law. They, in their own report, pointed out that the prosecutor at the ICTY, they've made the point, she had to apply unsuccessfully to the Security Council to extend the mandate until the further violence in Macedonia, which was a separate
The
conflict.
objection's overruled.
Thank you.
Please don't get into legal discussions with this witness. He's not a lawyer.
In your reports, you indicate that Carla Del Ponte applied to the UN Security Council for the extension of the mandate of the ICTY to post-1999, post-June 1999, and you then make the point that when the conflict erupted in Macedonia, she decided that she had herself, if you like, a re-established mandate because the ICTY mandate was linked to the existence of an armed conflict, correct?
So I don't recall that precise publication, but it does sound consistent with our work.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson. We're going to take a break right now for a half an hour. We'll come back at 25 minutes until 12.
Thank you.
The court usher will escort you out of the room.
I'm sorry, did you...
We are adjourned until 11:35.
All rise. All rise.
Be seated. Madam Usher, you can please bring in the witness. Mr. Roberts, do you have a time estimate?
Yes, Your Honour, a very accurate one. I have no questions at this stage. Thank you.
And Mr. Ellis?
5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Abramson, we are ready to proceed. The next questions will be from the Krasniqi defense, Mr. Ellis, who is to your far right.
Good morning, Mr. Abrahams.
Good morning.
You'll be pleased to hear I only have a small number of questions for you today, and they're based on the testimony that you gave in 2009 at the ICTY, I believe. So if I could have on screen, please, it's from IT 05 87.1, T3977 to T4052. And the relevant page is at page 4000. Beginning at line 19. Now, you were being asked some questions there about your interviews, and the question which you can hopefully see on your screen was, yesterday you told us that you started, or interviews with victims and witnesses started to be taped, as with the onset of the era of digitalization. Can you tell us whether back in 1998 and 1999, this sort of method was applied in Macedonia, Albania, and in Kosovo in general? And your response was, in general, no, it was not used. And that's correct, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
And the question continued, and we'll need to follow this over the page, so I'll pause after I read this line. Thank you. Were written statements given by victims and witnesses signed by them at all? And over the page, your response was, no, that is not HRW, Human Rights Watch procedure. And again, that's correct, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
I'll come back to that sort of issue in a moment, but just reading further down on this page, you were asked about the interpreters that you used, and your response at line 7, beginning at line 7, our interpreters were individuals from Kosovo, most of whom were at that time working as journalists and have subsequently gone on to careers as professional journalists in international media such as AP, Agence France Presse, and other agencies. And again, that's correct, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
And you were then asked about what languages the Human Rights Watch researchers working in Kosovo at the time spoke. And without going through all of the names, I think it's correct that apart from yourself, the others did not speak Albanian.
That is correct.
And in particular, it was Ben Ward, who worked on the 1999 report, Abuses in the New Kosovo. He didn't speak Albanian, did he?
Correct.
And then if we could jump forwards to page 4003. Towards the bottom of the page, line 21, the question was asked, the victims and witnesses you interviewed, did they have an opportunity to read the statement once you wrote it? And your response was, if they asked to review it, we would allow that, but usually they didn't, and so that rarely came up. And again, that remains correct, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Thank you, Your Honour. That was all I wished.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Redirect.
Extremely briefly, Your Honor. Thank you. Witness at page 104 through 105 of the real-time transcript You were asked about expressing a view that during 1998, a central command for the KLA was difficult to discern. And is it correct that you were not provided with access to internal KLA documentation to the extent that it existed?
That is correct.
Okay. And is it correct, therefore, you were not provided with such things as orders, reports, records of meetings, log books, and so on?
That is correct.
Thank you. That's all I had, Your Honor. Thank you.
Just have one comment on that, Your Honor, on that question. May I have one recross on that particular question?
One,
And just one question on this redirect with all due respect. So, and based on what your questions from Mr. Teeger, you told him, I guess over the weekend, this is paragraph 36, page 6 of the note, that you have a limited first-hand knowledge of the chain of command within the KLA. Isn't that right?
I'm sorry, to what are you referring to?
I'm referring to your preparatory note that was prepared by the SBO prior to coming here, where you told them in paragraph 36, page 6, that you have a limited first-hand knowledge of the chain of command within the KLA. Isn't that right?
Do you mind pulling it up? Is it
Sure.
possible? Because I just don't recall. I'm not trying to avert
absolutely.
your question.
please do so, Madam Court Officer.
I can read it for you, sir. I mean, it might
No,
be easy just to read it.
Let's put it up
Okay,
on the
sure.
screen.
I think they're calling it up.
Do you have a page and line again?
Yeah, it's paragraph 36, Judge. I unfortunately am doing the more primitive way of real paper.
We're okay. It's on the screen.
And so it notes that your W04408 noted that his firsthand knowledge of the chain of command was limited, and he couldn't say much more on the issue than that. Now, did you tell the SPO when you had your meeting with them on the 31st and 1st of September that your firsthand knowledge of the chain of command within the KLA was limited?
Yes, I did.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Judge Barta has a question. Some questions.
Indeed, some questions. Good morning,
Good morning,
Mr.
Judge.
Abrahams. As I just said, I have a few more questions for you. My first question is the following. In your interview with the SBO in September 2019 and April 2020, you said that, and I quote, "By 1998, any Albanian working for the Serbian state could have been considered a collaborator. Working for the state outside of Pristina or in a rural area was a risky endeavor." End of quote. For the record, this is from 075552 to 075578, page 17, paragraph 81. Mr. Abrams, you remember saying this to the SPO in 2019, 2020?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Could you explain this in more detail? In particular, why was it risky to work for the state outside of Pristina, and why did it make a difference if a person of Albanian ethnicity had worked in or outside Pristina at that time?
Yes. Broadly speaking, working for the Serbian state in any capacity, but particularly the security services, but not exclusively, was commonly viewed as a disloyal act. And I think the distinction I was trying to make between Pristina and other regions was not that that it was still an issue in Pristina. It was still an issue, but generally speaking, the armed wing and the armed movement and the KLA was present and more active outside of Pristina. And there were less protections outside of Pristina, mostly the less international presence. I think we're speaking 1998.
I think so.
Yes, because in 1998, certainly after March and the Drnica events, there was a high level of international attention, and many people in Pristina, myself, I mean, diplomats, journalists, many others, and that presence was less significant in other regions. So I think if that answers your
Yes, thank you. And in the following paragraph of your SPO interview, that is paragraph 82, you said the following, and I quote, I think it's not necessary to put that on the screen, it's just one sentence. Especially after the Kumanovo agreement, accusations of collaboration began to be leveled against wider categories of people. I do not recall having personally conducted research into ethnic Albanians who had been targeted or killed, but I heard credible allegations of intimidation and violence against individuals who were accused of collaboration with the Serbian state, end of quote. First of all, my question is, the Kumanovo agreement was concluded in June 1999. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And you said, Mr. Ahrens, that you cannot recall having personally conducted research into ethnic Albanians who had been targeted or killed, but you heard credible allegations of intimidation and violence against individuals, you said, who were accused of collaboration with the Serbian state. My question is, where and from whom did you hear these allegations, or in other words, what is the basis of this part of your statement?
Yes, thank you. So the core research, as we heard, was conducted by colleagues. I think the basis of my conclusions is from 2 trips and 2 extended periods in Kosovo after June 99. I believe it was August and December. And these are conversations with a wide range of individuals. So at that time, we were in close communication with local activists, local and international journalists, diplomats, and members of the international organizations active in Kosovo at the time, OSCE, UN, and NATO. I placed a particular weight on the views of those people, some of whom were investigating these cases for these international organizations, producing reports, some of which we saw, also speaking more informally with even KFOR soldiers, which I also did. And some of them expressed frustrations, I have to say, frustrations that they were not, that they were seeing violations occurring against, that they believed were committed by KLA members, and were having trouble getting traction within their organizations to report on these issues. So they shared information with us about that because they felt, and I do agree, there was a political pressure not to report. And we reference that in our reporting as well, statements by individuals, including the head of UNMIK, Bernard Kouchner, who, in our view, dismissed these allegations inappropriately. So that's the basis of on which I reached those conclusions.
And I think, thank you. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you were referring to international organizations, and you mentioned the OSCE and others, UN, United Nations, and NATO. Were you also in contact with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, at the time?
Yes, Your Honor, we were. We would have been in contact with a range of international organizations, including humanitarians. At the time, from UNHCR, the refugee agency, to many humanitarian, non-governmental humanitarian groups. So those would have been important interlocutors for us.
Thank you. And still in paragraph 82, Still in paragraph 82 of your SPO statement, you expressed your opinion in that case, based on years of research in Kosovo, it is said, that different categories of people, depending on the circumstances, were labeled by the KLA as collaborators, and I believe you distinguish between 6 different categories of collaborators. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Could you please elaborate on this? What were the different categories of collaborators, if you can recall?
Yes. In my view, there were the most, those at greatest risk were individuals who had worked as Serbian police or other security forces of the Serbian state, and those were, clearly marked as collaborators or traitors. The next level would be working not for security services, but the state in general, even in administrative functions. You could be a traffic policeman, but you may be also working, for a ministry or a state entity. Going down, and I don't know if I will break it into 6 categories, but generally the trajectory are people who openly criticized the KLA, condemned them, either spoke out about their policies or their practices, and those would include political rivals who had different views politically. If it was from the LDK party or others, were labeled as non-patriotic or against the cause. And then would be those who didn't necessarily contradict publicly, but didn't support adequately. And if there was a perception that this person was not endorsing or supporting the cause through their comments or their actions, that could also put a person under this label. The last category, and sorry if it was not 6, but was economic. And this was a factor, in my opinion, because there was a radical uprooting of the Kosovo economy, and an opportunity to entrench oneself, a person financially or economically, in ways legal and illegal, in a very chaotic and lawless environment. And my information, and I did have conversations with people who told me about this, that some of these clashes were motivated by economic interests and attempts to seize control of key parts of the Kosovo economy. And that there were cases when a person might be labeled as a collaborator as a way to marginalize them or perhaps eliminate them, perhaps even physically, although I don't have examples to point to that, for business reasons.
I understand. And following up on this, in paragraph 83 of your SPO statement, you said the following, and I quote, "According to my observations," you said, according to the protocol and analysis, the attitude towards alleged collaborators shifted after June 12, 1999, with less focus on those who had worked with the security forces, largely because most of these people promptly fled Kosovo when the Serbian and Yugoslav forces departed. As such, the harassment, intimidation, and violence shifted to those who had held civil functions or had competing political, economic, or business interests. First of all, is that still your evidence? And if so, could you please tell us more about how you came to these conclusions?
Yes, Your Honor, it still is my evidence. I mean, clearly, the people who worked for the security forces, most of them left. They understood the risks, and some of them very likely would have been implicated in serious crimes themselves and fled. That is what shifted. And the second part is the basis of my understanding is from the conversations, the research, and my time in Kosovo during that period, when I was told repeatedly by individuals who I trusted, and unofficially, meaning it was not a formal Human Rights Watch interviews per se, that there were intense struggles going on for control of key economic sectors in Kosovo at that time, and that the issue of collaboration was used within that context. I became yes. Well, I don't know if that answers your question adequately, but
Thank you. And one last point on that topic. In paragraph 84 of your SPO statement, you talked about disagreements between some commanders and influential members, as you said, of the KLA, over who would control key businesses and parts of the economy. Do you remember that?
yes, I do.
And how did you learn about these disagreements? And again, what was the basis for this part of your statement?
Yes, again, the basis would be the information that I received from the full spectrum of sources, which would be either KFOR or UN or OSCE investigators or staff members, some of them not formal investigators, humanitarians or activists, because we were all trying to understand the context in which we were working. Within that effort, it was important to try and figure out, well, what happened? There was an incident, and what took place? Was there a human rights element to this? Is it something I should, and we as an organization should look at more closely? And in response to those questions and our inquiries, we received sometimes cases of that, well, this was an internal conflict with an economic motivation.
That would be my next question, namely whether you have more information about these disagreements, for example, who disagreed with whom, which commanders were or influential members were involved, and which disagreements there were, etc.
Your Honor, I don't have specifics that I can share today, but I am willing to look at it more closely if it's of use to you.
That's fine, thank you. And Mr. Abrams, I have now some questions for you in relation to the two meetings you had with Mr. Thaçi in November 1998 and August 1999. And my first question is the following. You told us during your examination by the SPO that Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Limay, or the person who introduced himself as Čeliku, told you that the two Serbian journalists were not present during that trial, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do you remember which of the two, Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limay, told you that the two journalists were not present at their trial?
I would like to be precise and accurate with you,
Please.
so I'm afraid I have to say I do not recall. I believe it was Mr. Thaçi, but I have to be cautious. I'm not 100% certain.
That's fine, thanks. And did Mr. Thaçi and or Mr. Limay tell you why the two journalists were not present during that trial?
I don't believe receiving an answer to that question.
Did you ask that question?
I'm not sure. One general response we got was security. Mm-hmm. Right, that was one. That in particular, I think military secrecy was about the code of conduct, showing us the code of conduct. But they did speak about the security environment and the challenges in which it posed.
And you also told us during examination by the SPO that Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limay explained to you and Mr. Buchard, if I'm not mistaken, that the two journalists did not have a lawyer during their proceedings. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do you remember, again, the question whether it was Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limay who said that?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I don't want to state something I'm not certain of.
Did they mention, either Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limai, again, why the journalist did not have a lawyer?
So, to the best of my recollection, I believe they said that they were allowed to contact someone. I believe that's, and I think that's in one of my statements, or maybe we reported this, either public reporting or a statement. They made a call, I believe, is what we were told. I don't know if it is accurate or not. And this person did not attend, did not come.
I think you also told us yesterday that your request to visit the two journalists was declined.
Correct.
You recall saying this, right?
Yes.
And again, my question, I'm sorry for that, was it Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limai who declined, if you can remember your request to visit the two?
I'm not certain. I'm not certain.
How would you describe, in general terms, or maybe you can be more specific, the relationship between the two, Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Limai? Could you tell, for example, if one of the two was superior to the other, or were they of equal rank?
Yes, I can't speak to the ranking, but we definitely left that meeting with the impression that Mr. Thaçi was the senior of the two, had the most authority. He spoke primarily at the meeting, although I don't know if he answered with reference to your previous question, if he provided that information, but he was the predominant speaker and the position of with more authority in our perception.
I believe it was during your witness preparation session with the SPO, and I refer to paragraph 24 of the SPO's preparation note, that you said one of the two took notes during the meeting. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yes.
Can you say who took notes? Which of the two?
I believe it was Mr. Thaçi, but I'm not certain. I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer with precision.
That's fine. Coming back to what Mr. Kehoe from the Thaçi defense suggested during his cross-examination, I think it was yesterday, did Mr. Thaçi or Mr. Limai mention that one of the detainees, one of the two Serbian journalists, was suspected of being involved in criminal activities in the Serb Republic of Krajina and or in Bosnia in 1991 or 1992? Did one of the two mention that to you?
No, that did not come up in the meeting.
Now I have only a few questions in relation to your second meeting with Mr. Thaçi in his office in Pristina in, I believe, August 1999. And I think you said yesterday that the meeting was conducted in Albanian. Is that right?
That's correct.
So was that with or without the help of an interpreter?
Without.
And just a second. During the entire conversation, that means only Albanian was spoken and not, for example, English?
That's a good question. My recollection is it was predominantly Albanian. Yes.
So was it only you and Mr. Thaçi who were present during that conversation, or other people?
Correct. Only us.
But you cannot say whether either you or Mr. Thaçi spoke English.
I mean, there may have been phrases where we reverted or switched to English, but the meeting was predominantly in Albanian.
And did Mr. Thaçi tell you at that meeting that he was not, or it was not within his competence or his responsibility to deal with alleged human rights violations or human rights or violations of international humanitarian law by members of the KLA, or that you should submit your report to the competent or the relevant international authorities such as UNMIK, or that he would forward your report to these authorities?
I do not recall getting a response of that nature, Your Honor, no.
Thank you. Mr. Ahrens, in the course of the meetings with Mr. Thaçi in November 1998 and August 1999, did Mr. Thaçi tell you what he would personally do to prevent human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law by members of the KLA in the future?
My recollection is that he condemned violations. He restated the KLA's commitment to respect international humanitarian law, or the Geneva Conventions in particular. That certainly was the first meeting. And to the best of my recollection, in the second meeting, and of course, he did condemn some of the more significant attacks, the attack on the 14 farmers. In terms of concrete steps, I do not recall any information about concrete actions that he would take to investigate our findings or otherwise address this issue.
And this brings me to my last question. As you have indicated in your SPO preparation session, this is paragraph 35 of the preparation note. There was no follow-up whatsoever from Mr. Thaçi, his office, or from the provisional government at the time. Is that right?
That is correct.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Thank you.
I have just one question for you. At the first meeting between Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Limai and you were discussing the journalist's trial, did they mention a judge making the decision?
No, Your Honor, I do not recall mention of a judge. No.
Okay, that's all. Judge Metro.
Thank you, Judge Smith. I have a series of questions for you, Mr. Abrams, about two aspects of your evidence that you were asked about by the parties. One has to do with the role and the powers of Mr. Thaçi and your understanding of it, and the second part has to do with certain aspects of your 10 November 1998 meeting with Mr. Thaçi and Limai. So starting with Mr. Thaçi's role and power and your perception of it, without putting words in your mouth, is it fair to suggest that your understanding of his role and powers at the time was more of a figurehead within the KLA rather than a decision-making individuals who had an impact on the action and the activities of the KLA? Is that a fair description?
Yes, Your Honor, I consider that a fair description, while also saying that he was not a person with no influence whatsoever. He did have a prominence and a respected name.
And I want to look at that in the context of some of the items that were shown to you by the parties. The first one is Exhibit P377, and I'll ask the registry to please bring it up. And you will see in a second, Mr. Abrams, it's part of your 1998 report. And I'll ask the registry to please go to page 24 first. Thank you. I hope you recall you were read and shown this section of your report, which starts on October 18, and it goes on to discuss the fate of Mr. Radošević and Dobricic. Do you recall being shown that part?
Yes, I do.
And as I understand, this is a part of the report that you prepared, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And if we can please go to the next page, that'd be page 25. There's a paragraph there that starts, and I'll read it for you with the words, on November 27, in honor of the Albanian Flag Day, the KLA released the two journalists in the presence of U.S. diplomat William Walker, who heads the Organization for Security and Cooperation, OSCE mission in Kosovo, two ethnic Albanian political activists from the Democratic League of Kosovo, LDK, in Mališevo, Jakub Kastrati and Cendescu, who had been in KLA detention for 3 weeks, were also amnestied. A KLA communique released on November 27 said the amnesty demonstrated the KLA's commitment to international conventions governing warfare. And it goes on to say, on November 24, the KLA released a Serb policeman after U.S. diplomatic intervention. Now, if we can scroll down, or maybe go back up, please, I'm sorry, it's my fault. If you look at, there's a footnote 66 about the amnesty. Do you see that, Mr. Abrams?
If they could please scroll, oh yes, I see, yes.
And if we scroll down to that, to the actual footnote, it refers as support for the suggestion a press article of November 27, 1998, entitled "The KLA General Headquarters Declares an Amnesty for 2 Tanjug reporters and 2 LDK activists." And that was the basis, I understand, for your suggestion about the existence of an amnesty and the rest of the sentence there, correct?
To the best of my recollection, that's correct, Your Honor, yes.
Can we then please see Exhibit 1D47, please? And that, again, Mr. Abrams, is a document you were shown by the Thaçi defense earlier. And I'll give you a chance to acquaint yourself with it, and just tell me when you've read it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Your Honor, I've sufficiently reviewed it.
So, is it fair to suggest that this appears to be the communique that the article on which you rely makes reference, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And it also suggests, doesn't it, that the amnesty in question had been granted by the general staff of the KLA. Would that be correct?
That is correct. That's my understanding from this communique.
And it also suggests, I think it's the third paragraph, that consistent with the article and the report you cited, that it contains a reference to the KLA's commitment, and I don't use the exact term, but that it recognizes the importance and relevance of international conventions of warfare and peace. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And it does, in the first paragraph, second sentence, says the prison term of the journalists was seized. And pausing there for a moment, it suggests, doesn't it, that these journalists were in fact serving a sentence or prison term. Is that right?
That is my understanding from this, yes.
And that, if I understand your evidence correctly, is consistent with what Mr. Limay and or Mr. Thaçi would have told you during your 10 November 98 meeting, correct?
Yes, that they had been convicted.
And maybe just as a more general question, you've been asked about your sources and what weight you gave to various types of sources. What, if anything, was the relevance of these types of communiques for you in terms of what, I don't want to use the technical term probative value, but what importance would you give to these sorts of documents?
We would place a high value on these communiques because they are produced by the official structures of, in this case, the armed group. So statements produced by the parties to the conflict are for us considered important information, without any doubt.
Thank you. Can we see Exhibit 1D48? And that was, again, something that was shown to you by the Thaçi defense. These are purported notes of Mr. Kurti that purport to reflect the views of Mr. Adem Demaci. Can I ask you to reacquaint yourself with paragraph 5 in this document?
Yes, Your Honor.
So here what we have is, as I understand these notes, we have Mr. Demaci, or at least Mr. Kurti, expressing the views of Mr. Demaci that it would be, and I quote, a good idea, end of quote, for the journalists to be released, and the next sentence where he's recorded as expressing the view that it would be good for their release to take place on the celebrations for the 28th November. Do you see that?
I do, Your Honor.
And is that consistent with your views about the roles and power of Mr. Demaci, that he expresses a wish or a hope and that it's left to someone else to decide?
It is consistent. And that's how I read this material, that it was their view, or his view, and perhaps Mr. Kurti's view, that this would be a good idea.
Can we then see a document with an ERN 0614-27-11-TR-ET revised? And that, just to contextualize it for you, Mr. Abrams, is the transcript of a press conference, and you've been discussing press conferences as well, where two individuals are participating. It's Mr. Adem Demaci and Mr. Ibrahim Rugova. And you will see from the content that the date of it would have come towards the end of November, but before the release of Mr. Radošević and Mr. Dobricic, so around the last week of November. Now, can I ask you to focus first on the second paragraph? This is a statement attributed to Mr. Demaci, and he says, "You also know that on 19 I received a letter from Mr. Milan Milutinovic in my Kosovo Liberation Army office in Pristina. We have prepared a response to that letter. In any case, we will try to remain in contact because our office, in the first place, and the institution of the General Representation of Kosovo Liberation Army was set up to primarily keep contact, get into contact with the Serbian side, with which we are in conflict." Now, again, asking you, is that consistent, or does that conflict with your understanding of what the role and function of Mr. Demaci and his office was at the time?
That is consistent with my perception of Mr. Demaci's role.
Can we then go to page 3 of that record? And I'll ask you to look, sir, under the timestamp 01053. And there's a question by a journalist which says this: following Goran Zbilić release, families and relatives of Nebojša Radošević and Kicho Dobricic are voicing doubt that the two are still alive despite your statement to the contrary. Now, to to the extent you can recall, in your report that I read a moment ago, you make reference to a policeman, a Serbian policeman being released on the 24th of November. Can you recall if that was in fact the individual who's mentioned here, Mr. Zbilic?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I cannot.
That's okay. If we then look at the response of Mr. Thaçi, and it's under timestamp 1108, he says, "Let me reassure you and your families with whom I sympathize. I know how much my mother and sister worried about me, despite being able to visit me perhaps once a month. I know what it means to be in prison, and let me reassure you that the two journalists in question are alive and well." Is that consistent with what Mr. Thaçi would have told you before you had your meeting with Mr. Thaçi and Limay, or did he tell you nothing about the state and the condition of the detainees?
No, that is consistent, Your Honor.
Then, stay in the same paragraph, towards the end of it, it starts with the words, "However, I'm not entitled." And Mr. Thaçi is recorded as saying this, "However, I'm not entitled to interfere with these matters. I can only interfere as a human, a humanitarian, and come up with good proposal. You know very well that it is not up to me." Now again, I'll ask you the same question. Is it consistent with what Mr. Thaçi told you when you met him, that he did not have the decision-making power over the fate of these individuals, or does this conflict with what he told you?
That is consistent. I left the meeting with Mr. Thaçi in which this was discussed with the distinct impression that he did not have the authority to release these people.
Can we then go to page 5 now? And if you look on the timestamp 1925, you will see that they are back to discussing the fate of Goran Zbilic, who is referred by a journalist as a Serbian policeman, and Mr. Thaçi corrects him and says that he was an inspector in the police. And then in the next paragraph, 1927, he is being asked about a comment or a statement that Mr. Zbilic made upon his release. And then Mr. Thaçi says this, timestamp 1942. "I was not there when Mr. Zbilic talked to you. I deliberately was not there, and I believe you when you quote his words, if those were indeed the words said by Mr. Zbilic. As you can see, the General Staff of the Liberation Army accepted my plea, my call, that one should have understanding for these people, so my call was 100% heard. As far as that demand made by the General Staff is concerned, this is a general demand to the Serbian forces to refrain from making provocation in places where there are no Serbs and where they have no reason to enter." So again, same question, is it consistent that here we have Mr. Thaçi, by his own word, talking of a plea to the General Staff that was granted in relation to the release of these individuals? Is that consistent or inconsistent with your understanding of his role and position?
Your Honor, I find this consistent with his position.
And maybe last at page 7, if you go on the timestamp 2819, just read the paragraph for yourself. It talks about political discussions and the formation of an assembly to form a government. And the answer, 2846, of Mr. Thaçi to the journalist's question is that I have authorization from the Kelly General Staff to form the assembly, to form the government, to form the negotiating group. Again, same question, is that consistent with your understanding that Mr. Thaçi would be acting, at least in this particular context, under the authorization of the KLA General Staff, or is that conflicting with your understanding?
No, this is also consistent.
Thank you. I want to ask you about something else you were asked then. Do you recall being asked about your reference, and if you feel it necessary, I'll go back to your report, but about the existence of prison number 7 and the basis of your of the origin of the information that led you to make a reference to that prison. Do you recall these questions?
I do, Your Honor.
I'll ask the registry, please, to go into private session for a moment for the security of the person concerned.
Your Honors, we're in public session.
Thank you. And Mr. Abrams, I want to ask you about something you said Mr. Thaçi and or Limay would have told you, namely that the KLA was effectively an army in the process of being made, in the process of formalizing its structures. And you recall, I hope, that you asked about what Mr. Buchart had said about it. Do you recall these questions?
I do, Your Honor.
I want to go back to that statement. It's ERN U00081334. That's the statement of your colleague, Mr. Buchart. And I will go to the paragraph in question that you were shown. It's at page 7, please. And I'll ask the registry first to go to paragraph 36, it is. So just take a second to read it. And Mr. Kehoe asked you specifically about the second sentence, which reads, at this stage, Thaçi explained that the UÇK was a new army and only just formalizing its structure. Is that consistent with your own recollection of what Mr. Thaçi, it seems, told you about it?
It is, Your Honor, yes.
And then the next sentence says, he, being Mr. Thaçi and Limay, stated that the UÇK had a military court, military police, and secret police, although they do not provide details of these bodies. Now, again, is that consistent with your own recollection of what Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Limay told you about what already existed at that time, 10 November 98?
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, during that meeting, I understand you and or Mr. Buchart to have expressed concerned about the treatment of detainees by the KLA and the KLA's general compliance with its obligations under international law. Is that how we should understand it?
That is correct, yes.
And can you tell us what the reaction of Mr. Limay and or Mr. Thaçi, to the extent you can recall, was to those criticism or these concerns?
The reaction was with 2 points. One, a stated commitment to respect their obligations, an acknowledgement of the obligations, and also these claims that the Army was in formation, although it had these bodies mentioned here: military court, military police, and secret police. Of those 3, military police I had direct experience with. We met individuals who said they were from the military police, so that I took to be true. So that was their position at the time.
And while we're on the statement of Mr. Buchart, can we go to page 10 of that document, please? And I'll ask the registry to focus on paragraph 55, please. And I'll let you again acquaint yourself with the content of that paragraph.
55, you say?
55, please, yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, do you recall whether in the context of your discussions with Mr. Limay and Thaçi, whether you or Mr. Buchart made a reference to that statement attributed to Mr. Krasniqi about the KLA's commitment to abide by the Geneva Conventions? Do you have a memory of that?
I don't believe we referenced Mr. Krasniqi's statements, no.
Thank you. That was all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Smith. Could I ask the Madam Court Officer to bring up the witness's preparation note at paragraph 26, please? Now, witness, I just want to follow on some evidence you've just given about your meeting on the 10th of November 1998 with Thaçi and Limai, and setting aside your discussion about the two Tanyo journalists, you were also discussing the other allegations of laws of war violations by the KLA. In the preparation note at paragraph 26, I just want to direct your attention to the relevant part. You said, you and Mr. Buchart raised the issue of other allegations of laws of war violations by the KLA. It was not an abstract discussion. They made clear that there were concrete allegations. It says that you believed that they discussed abductions, maltreatment, and killings as among the forbidden acts about which you had received allegations in relation to the KLA, but the discussion was obligations-based and not intended to be about specific incidents. The note goes on to say that you might have discussed incidents or allegations that were part of the October report, for example, Rahavats and Belasevats. First of all, is your reference to the October report, is that a reference to the first October 1998 report entitled Humanitarian Law Violations in Kosovo?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Did you provide a copy of that report to Thaçi and Limai at that meeting?
Not that I recall, no.
Why not?
I'm not sure why. With retrospect, it would have been a good idea to present the concrete information. I think at that time, we didn't know with whom we were meeting or what to expect. So we did not bring any material, to the best of my knowledge, with us to that meeting.
Now, in that report of the 1st of October 1998, it states, quote, the KLA has also committed serious violations of international humanitarian law, including the taking of hostages and extrajudicial executions. An estimated 138 ethnic Serbs and a number of ethnic Albanians and Roma are missing in circumstances in which KLA involvement is suspected. At least 39 of them were last seen in KLA custody, unquote. So you were the principal author of that report, isn't that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So you had at least some details about the missing 138 persons and in particular the 39 who were last seen in KLA custody.
That's correct, as in our report.
Yes. Now, did you press details about the missing 138 people with Thaçi and Limai to the best of your recollection?
No, we did not.
And can I ask you, from your perspective as a human rights organization, you were having a meeting with senior members of the KLA. Was this not a golden opportunity to press that issue with them?
It's a good question. So the context of that meeting was our effort to make the initial contact with this armed group. And again, not knowing with whom we would meet. And I think our approach at the time was to open a line of communication on human rights issues, to continue this exchange, and to establish a relationship in which we could continue to share our concerns and obtain information relevant to our work. So I think that part of that was the reasons for the manner of our engagement was with that longer-term process in mind. However, I'm relaying to you how I recall thinking about it in 1999. looking back with the retrospect of 25 years is another thing. First of all, not knowing that we would not meet them again until after the conflict, not knowing how long the conflict was going to last at that point in November, of course. And if I had known this was our one and only opportunity, I probably would have pursued it with a different approach and dug more deeply into the specifics.
And you've partly answered my question, but I just want to ask you about details of suspected KLA killings of perceived collaborators of Albanian ethnicity. At that time in your research, did you have details of such killings?
By that time in November, we would have published, the information that we had would have been what was published in our October report.
And do you recall at this stage whether you may have raised the issue of suspected KLA killings, not of ethnic Serbs, but of suspected collaborators of Albanian ethnicity with Thaçi and Limaj?
I remembered the broad strokes of our conversation, but I cannot testify that we specifically raised attacks on collaborators. It is definitely possible because that was a topic of concern, but I can't say with certainty that we dug into it.
I understand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Judge Smith.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Any follow-up questions?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Any follow-up questions, Mr. Laws?
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor, I have significant follow-up questions. Number one. Number two, there were two matters that came up during the judge's questions on documents that weren't in anybody's queue. I don't know what's in that document. This is really the first time to review it. So if it's not in someone's queue, certainly we don't prepare for it. So I need some time to be able to go through that queue.
We have until 1 o'clock today, and it's probably obvious that the witness is going to have to come back to complete matters. Is that what you
I was exactly going to say that. I have about an hour arising out of the judge's questions.
Okay. So we will break now. The courtroom is going to be used by another body. So we will ask you to be back Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and we will commence at that time. You will no doubt be finished on Monday, though. So, Madam Usher, please escort the witness out. Remember not to talk about this case with anyone outside the courtroom.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Your Honor? The two documents in the queue? I just saw them on the screen. I don't have them with me now, no. No, obviously I think we'll go through those documents, but I don't have them, and I do believe so. I have to check. May I check with the Brain Trust here?
I just want to make sure you have it all. All right. So we'll see you all Monday morning.
May I just have one mention, Judge? So I'm going to have to look at these documents, and I would ask leave to be able to upload any additional documents I may want to use to respond to that, because I just don't know if I am or I'm not, but I would like some leave to be able to do that. It won't be extensive.
We've been fairly liberal about the presentation queues up till now from all parties, so we will consider that. I can't promise you anything because I don't know what it is, but we'll see you Monday morning at 9 o'clock. We are adjourned. Oh.
I just wanted to make one observation, if I may. Our presentation queue now includes the ruling in the Milutinovic case, which I addressed you on briefly at the outset of this witness's testimony. I think I may have inadvertently misled the court by saying that was part of the court's final judgment. In fact, it was a ruling on the admissibility of the under orders report, which, of course, the court in that case marked for identification but did not admit, having heard Mr. Abraham's testimony. Now, Your Honour made the point in the ruling that it was admitted and then evaluated. The reason that's relevant is because at an appropriate moment, and I can do it, certainly not during the examination of the witness, I'm going to invite the court to reconsider the ruling on that particular document, Chapter 10, because it was immediately made admissible. It was given a P number and admitted, whereas in fact, the appropriate course we will submit is, having heard the testimony in the light of the approach in that case, which is very detailed, the under orders report falls very clearly on the wrong side of the admission line.
Okay. Make that in writing, please.
Yes, very well.
All rise.